News. In just a moment, the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Before that, though, our top stories here this evening. And Donald Trump says he'll hold talks on possible intervention in Syria in the coming hours, with a decision to be made fairly soon. Here, the cabinet ministers have agreed on the need to take action in Syria to deter the further use of chemical weapons. And the international chemical watchdog has confirmed that Novichok was used in the Salisbury nerve agent attack. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they come in. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist, Isabel Oakeshott. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look then at those front pages. And the headline on The Guardian, path clear for military action as Cabinet backs May over Syria crisis. And as Britain, America and France decide whether to take military action in Syria, the Metro describes their deliberations as a council of war. The largest US air and naval strike force since the 2003 Iraq war is now heading for Syria. That's on the front of The Times. And that story also makes the front of The Eye. The Daily Telegraph reports that Jeremy Hunt breached anti-money laundering legislation brought in by his own party when purchasing 7 luxury flats. The Daily Mirror quotes Sir Cliff Richard, who says the BBC ruined his life when they named him as a suspected paedophile. He's never been charged with any crime. The Financial Times reports that councils in England are struggling to stay well funded due to the impact of central government cuts and rising social care costs. Experts quoted in The Express say that NHS advice on eating carbohydrates is actually contributing to obesity. So let's talk through some of those front page stories and some stories inside as well with Isabel Oakeshott and Sonia Sodha. And not all the front pages covering whether or not there are imminent attacks on Syria, but you picked out some of the ones that have to kick off with. There's The Guardian's front page, path clear for military action as the cabinet backs Theresa May over Syria. Yeah, there's a real mixture, as you say, on the front pages tomorrow, with some papers quite bizarrely deciding that there are other more important stories and whether we're about to get involved in what's very likely to be a controversial military action in Syria. I think one of the key angles for voters here is this question of whether or not the Commons will have a say on it. And it does look very like Theresa May has made what, in my opinion, is the right decision not to try to consult the Commons over this. Some people probably remember what happened, excuse me, when David Cameron tried to do this and failed to get a Commons vote through backing limited military action in Syria. I think Theresa May will be incredibly conscious of what a humiliation that was and doesn't want to risk that. And there is, in fact, no legal reason why she has to consult the Commons. She doesn't need the permission of MPs to order the armed forces to get involved in an allied operation against Assad's regime. And she clearly got the backing she was looking for from her cabinet, and that is enough to give her the political cover that she needs to go ahead. Well, that's right, and the cabinet broke up after a long meeting, 2-hour meeting, talking about the need to take action to alleviate humanitarian distress and to deter the further use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. So what's your view, Sonia? Jeremy Corbyn thinks that this should be discussed by MPs. Do you think he's right?
I mean, I agree that it should come before Parliament. I think since Iraq, not before Iraq, Isabel is right, but since Iraq, there has sort of been a precedent that these things are discussed by Parliament, and I think it's best practice. That said, I do agree with Isabel that back in 2013, Parliament didn't cover itself in glory. It felt like there was a parliamentary majority in favour of limited military action then, but because of sort of bizarre party politics, the way it played out, I don't think either party leadership actually came out of it well. Parliament voted against military action, and then that led to President Obama taking a step back from it. So I think I agree with Corbyn, it should go before Parliament. I agree that it is right to try and uphold that red line against chemical weapons that stands in international law. However, you've got to ask, yes, we should be doing it now, but why didn't we do it back in 2013? And I think there's never been any good solution when it comes to the Syrian conflict. It's incredibly complex. There's a massive risk that by getting involved militarily, we will make it worse. But there are also huge risks to non-intervention, and we've seen incredible loss of life in Syria over the last 5 years, 4.5 years, since Parliament voted not to uphold the convention, the law against chemical weapons back in 2013. So I don't think anyone thinks that military intervention here is going to solve the problem, but it does come to this issue about the international law. There is a red line on chemical weapons. It's not been upheld, actually. Obama said he was going to draw the line. He didn't, and I think it is right to do it now.
Do you think that's right? I mean, it's a difficult balance, isn't it, to make sure that you stick by the red lines and send out a deterrent message, and yet the risks are very, very high, aren't they?
Nobody is claiming that there are any easy options here, or that we're going to resolve anything by what are potentially just pinprick strikes that there were last time. It does look, from the build-up of military assets, as if it's going to be rather a lot more than that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's bring in the paper while you talk about that. The front page of the Times talks about that build-up of military assets.
Yes, and I must say that of all the papers that have come in so far, the Times coverage is by far the most comprehensive on what's going on. They've got some fantastic pictures and on the inside pages, which hopefully we may be able to see at some point later. They've got some really good detail. So it does look like this is going to be a rather more ambitious undertaking. I completely agree with Sonia. I mean, it would be ridiculous to be blithe and glib about this and say that, we can solve this problem. But that said, doing nothing hasn't worked. And as Sonia says, the issue over the rules-based international order is really important. If we have these international conventions, we have these humanitarian law, we have to enforce that, otherwise everything just disintegrates.
But what about proof? Theresa May, after this cabinet meeting, the statement talked about it being highly likely that Syria was behind it. President Macron is talking about having proof. Is that enough?
I think so. I don't think there's a huge amount of doubt about who had the capability, the means and the will to use chemical weapons against the Syrian people in this way. It's not the first time that we've seen it happen. So for me, it's not really a lack of evidence or a lack of proof that's a problem. It is some of the risks that we've talked about. And I think it's an even riskier situation now in 2016 than it was back in 2018, rather, than it was back in 2013. We've got President Trump in the White House, a much more aggressive Putin in Russia. It feels like that there's a greater risk now with Iran and Russia lined up alongside Assad, that if we take an action which, for example, were to be seen as a strike against Russia, for example, if Russian military personnel were to lose their lives, there is a very real danger that this could escalate very quickly into a much bigger conflict between the West and Russia.
I mean, I do think that military leaders will be more than conscious of that. And as Trump said in his characteristic, rather simple way, smart weapons, they will be extremely careful. The evidence tonight is that there is a dialogue going on between the White House and the Kremlin over what's going to happen, and essentially that should hopefully minimise or really rather eliminate.
Warnings were issued a year ago, weren't they, when the strike was carried out by President Trump?
That's right, and I think that kind of dialogue is designed to eliminate the prospect of any kind of accidental hitting of any Russian assets. Of course, you can't ever completely eliminate that. The other thing I think is interesting is the role of Emmanuel Macron in this crisis. I think we've seen him very much step up. I think the role that he is giving himself here shows his ambitions to take over from Merkel as the kind of key figure within the EU. Merkel is weakened politically, domestically. She's been around for a long time, and I think Emmanuel Macron really sees himself as the new sort of unofficial leader of the EU. And it's interesting that he's using this as an opportunity to create a platform for himself as quite an interventionist figure, potentially.
Well, yes, and in the meantime, we wait to hear more developments. Donald Trump today day talking about raising more questions about the timing of a possible attack. And tonight we've heard from the White House that Donald Trump has not made a final decision on the Syria response. So still plenty to wait and hear about. In the meantime, let's move on to the front page of the Daily Telegraph tomorrow. Syria not there as one of their main stories. The main story that they've got is about Jeremy Hunt.
I mean, we picked this out almost because it's so bizarre. I mean, I think looking at the front of that paper, you see this enormous picture of a lion, nothing about war at all. And then this frankly bizarre story about Jeremy Hunt apparently having bought a series of flats. He's a very wealthy man, self-made, I should say. He did very well before he came into the Commons through a kind of language lesson business that he set up. He's now multi-millionaire, and he bought a number of flats in Southampton, which he apparently didn't quite meet the rules for in terms of how he bought them through a company and didn't declare it properly to HMRC. He has now corrected that. He's apologised. I think this is a great story to use in the summer months where absolutely nothing else is happening. It's a great Sunday newspaper story in a dull week. Why they've put it on the front page today of all days, or rather tomorrow's front pages, I am utterly bemused.
I mean, I agree it's a surprise not to see Syria more prominently on the Telegraph front page. I do think it's a bit more of a significant story, though. What we've got here is a cabinet minister who, you know, he has said that he's made a mistake, he has apologised for it and corrected it, but he breached anti-money laundering legislation that was introduced by his own government by buying these flats through a company and not declaring it. So I think it is troubling. It's stuff that other people have had to pay fines for, can even end up in jail for. It carries a potential risk of a prison sentence of up to 2 years. So it's really not great for a government that has introduced anti-money laundering legislation to be in a position where one of its key ministers is found to have broken that, whether it was advertently or not. We don't know.
And just to say that the Downing Street spokesman said here, Jeremy has rightly apologised for an administrative oversight, and as the Cabinet Office made clear, there's been no breach of the ministerial code. We consider the matter closed.
I'm just not buying into Jeremy Hunt, the money launderer. Sorry, it doesn't ring true for me. It's an administrative error.
OK, we're going to take a break right now. Don't go anywhere. Coming up, the councils who say they're strapped for cash because of an increasing demand for social care. That and more when we get back.